This is Crosscut Reports. I'm Sara Bernard. Today, we turn to a perennial equity issue in public education, PTAs. Also known as PTSAs, or Parent-Teacher-Student Associations, these parent-led groups have spent decades focused primarily on fundraising. And that can create huge disparities between schools, since wealthy parents can often afford to donate money or spend time organizing fundraisers, while lower-income parents can't always find that money or time. Crosscut Associate News Editor Venice Buhain recently dug into this problem in Seattle and met some of the people trying to solve it. Some local PTSAs, for instance, have begun pooling resources and distributing those funds between schools and their neighborhoods. But there are also those who are trying to buck even that trend and change the PTSA paradigm completely. So, Venice, you've been looking for some time into PTSAs, or Parent-Teacher-Student Associations in Seattle. And, these are groups that I think most people in the U.S. who have experience in public education, either because their kids go to public schools or because they went to public schools, usually the first thing people might think of is fundraiser.
This is the PTA crew, and we're here to tell you about our fundraiser. Yes.
And that is kind of what your story is about in some ways, that kind of knee-jerk definition of PTSA. But before we jump into all that, I was wondering if you could tell me what launched you on this reporting in the first place. What had your understanding been of the role that PTSAs play in Seattle public schools, and what were you interested in finding out?
Yeah, so that was my knee-jerk reaction as well when I think about PTSAs, or PTAs as they're sometimes called. I think of selling chocolates or like a book sale or something like that. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
We're selling Little Caesars pizza cards, so every time you buy a pizza...
What initially got me interested was the Southeast Seattle Fundraising Alliance, which is a group of about a dozen, give or take a few, schools in Southeast Seattle that sort of pooled their efforts together to do a big move-a-thon.
I'm excited about the move-a-thon because I love to exercise.
Right, so they go out and they solicit donations from the community and community members, and then they have their students do different activities, like they do some dancing or they walk some blocks, right?
I'm excited about 12 schools in the Rainier Valley and Beacon Hill working together to fundraise. Go Square, are you excited about?
Spending an hour outside.
Some of these schools had not ever had a fundraiser because, it's just because their PTAs are, their families are busy, right? A lot of these schools are in lower income areas or Title I schools, and so their families don't have the type of resources that other families in other areas have. So I thought that was an interesting and kind of, like an interesting way to sort of like solve the problem of like, what do you do for a school where you don't have either experience with fundraising or you don't have a community that, can just go out and buy a bunch of chocolates, as opposed to some other schools where you had families who can, a couple of years ago, there was a PTSA that auctioned off a Tesla, right?
Whoa.
Just to kind of compare the ability of different communities. Some of these are schools where families tend to be like wealthier. Maybe they have flexible work hours, or maybe both parents don't have to work. There's more of an ability to kind of drum up these kinds of donations and drum up this kind of effort to raise like hundreds of thousands of dollars for your PTSA.
Right. So this coalition in Southeast Seattle is having a sort of group fundraiser, and then they're distributing the money evenly between participating schools?
Actually, so the first year that they did this, and they started this actually the pandemic year.
Oh.
When I talked to one of the organizers, Christina Jimenez, she was saying that in the first year, they ended up helping families directly who needed help because during the pandemic year, there was, people who lost jobs and, that sort of thing. And so people kind of needed that direct help that way. And then the next year, it was sort of kind of distributed without thinking about equity. So it was kind of just split evenly because that was actually, when they first started it, that was what they promised everyone. Mm-hmm. But in 2020, there was also a societal heightened awareness of equity and racial equity especially, and that was due to the George Floyd protests. Mm-hmm. A lot of people had already been thinking about racial equity, but then this sort of like kind of brought that conversation into to a broader audience. And it was like kind of suddenly forefront in people's minds. So the Southeast Seattle Fundraising Alliance kind of started considering that in how they divided the money. And so there's a equity component to how they divide the money now.
So they divide the money up according to need.
Yes, that's right. The other thing that I want to mention, though, is that they're still not raising like Tesla money. What they're doing is they're buying, art supplies and copy paper, things that the school still needs, but they're not like hiring staff.
So this group in South Seattle has kind of recognized the inequities between schools who have more active PTSAs versus schools who don't. And you stumbled across another group of parents or PTSA organizing happening in another neighborhood, right? In West Seattle?
Yes, that's right. So in my reporting, I found the West Seattle Public School Equity Fund.
We're a local nonprofit that launched in April 2021 and dispersed our first round of fund shifting this school year. Yay!
They've got a different approach than the Southeast Seattle group. What they're doing is all of the elementary schools in that area are teaming together, and they have looked at which schools are Title I schools, which are schools that get money from the federal government because a certain percentage of their families are low income. And so they looked at which schools are Title I and which schools are not Title I. And the non-Title I schools kind of pool their money together, and then a certain amount is raised, and then it gets divided among the schools that need it.
The thing that's particularly unique about West Seattle and our District 6 is that our schools are pretty much like half Title I schools and half well-resourced schools, divided almost exactly along the previous redlining zones.
So they're distributing it to the Title I schools, but there's also an equity component in how they distribute it. So it's by need as well.
And so, these two examples suggest that there is, at the very least, a recognition that the system as it exists, it's just not really fair. And something that you unearthed in your reporting was some data around the kind of inequities we're talking about. Like you mentioned, the difference between art supplies or copy paper and a reading specialist. I wonder if you could talk about the kinds of things that some schools are able to get because of PTSA funding in Seattle.
So the Seattle Public Schools actually has a grants list, because if you want to hire a person, then you have to kind of give a grant to the Seattle Public Schools, and then they can decide to accept the grant, and then they have to use it for whatever it is that the money targets. So I guess I want to preface this by saying, I was not trying to write a story that vilified any schools for raising money to hire extra help. Previous coverage of the inequities of PTSAs is that you tend to focus on something like, oh my gosh, this school was able to get a Tesla and and they raised over $200,000 and they bought everybody in the band an instrument. So it's let's look at these rich schools, going out and raising money to buy privileges for their rich kids, right? That I wanted to avoid that kind of approach. Folks in the West Seattle group and also the Southeast Seattle group pointed out that this is, everybody's just trying to do the right thing for their kids, right? People see a need and and parents are trying to fill it. So it's not out of evil intent.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to focus instead on what the status quo and what the system is, right? It's sort of almost like I'm not trying to hate the player. This is the game that the parents are stuck in, right? If schools aren't providing everything that you think that your student needs, then, your options are you either have to go without or you go out and you raise the money to hire that person. And so, it's not like they were going out and trying to do anything wrong.
Yeah.
But I will go through my list and talk about some of the things we mentioned. So at McGillivray Elementary School in Madison Park, it's, got 11% low income and it's 39% students of color. They had a grant last year for $126,000 for a little bit more than a half-time academic intervention specialists and 2 tutors and the art program. And this is like I'm getting this information from a list that the Seattle Public Schools keeps of like the major grants. At Whittier Elementary School in Ballard, which is 8.3% low income and 26% students of color, they spent $75,000 for a halftime reading interventionist and a halftime teacher. Salmon Bay K-8 in Ballard, they hired one full-time teacher, one part teacher, and then a part-time nurse, and that was $85,000. These are, just to kind of give an idea of like schools that are able to have these big fundraisers are, able to bring in extra resources that other schools don't have access to. Like in some ways, this is sort of exacerbating the inequity that already exists in the individual schools.
And it seems like, the people you talk to, for example, in South Seattle and West Seattle who are thinking about these things and sort of trying different ways to ameliorate these problems, it's like it seemed like they were kind of telling you, like, they don't blame anyone for raising more money for their school. They're just saying we're trying to sort of recognize that there's an imbalance there, and we're trying to balance the scales a little bit in whatever way.
Yeah. Well, I will say that especially in West Seattle, other folks in the neighborhood would question the need for this because, people out there who are sort of familiar with what Title I is, like their reasoning is that, the schools with the low-income families, they get extra money from the government, and so like they should be able to get their reading specialists because they are getting, they're getting more money than my kid is getting. They don't look at it as if the Title I funding is sort of filling in for what kids in wealthier areas already have access to, in terms of like at home or maybe like, in other parts of their lives. That's the sort of thing that like Title I money is ostensibly supposed to address. And a family from another school might look at it more like, oh, well, if a Title I school gets more money per kid, and so I'm just trying to address what they see as an inequity. One of the parents said it was like, the attitude is a little bit like the Hunger Games. Like, you're like all these parents sort of fighting for a finite number of resources, or what they see as a finite number of resources. And so it's like they're all kind of fighting each other for the same extra bit of money.
But I think the questions that your reporting raises are really important ones about the whole public education system. There's sort of some movements that are taking steps beyond even, it seems, what the South Seattle group and the West Seattle group are doing and saying, maybe we should rethink the whole system. Maybe we should shift the whole paradigm. Maybe PTAs, PTSAs shouldn't be focused on fundraising at all.
Yeah, I mean, that was a question that was some of these groups were raising as well. And just looking at, like, how can a PTA and a PTSA, how can they kind of start to focus on advocacy for their students and their schools rather than spend all their energy on fundraising? Because fundraising takes energy, it takes time. And for some folks, it's sort of like, well, if you could spend some of that energy and time, like at a school board meeting or down in Olympia during the legislative session, all right, that might be another way to kind of like make sure everybody can get resources. I mean, it's still the parents in the most resourced areas that have the time to, who have the time to like show up at a school board meeting and advocate for their school, or who have the time to take a day and go down to Olympia or like write letters to their legislators.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that seems like maybe it's not a perfect solution perhaps, but it sort of widens the perspective. If you have people advocating at the school board level, at the state level, then that's a wider angle than necessarily an individual school. But yeah, tell me about the Take Back PTA movement.
So I was speaking to Vivian Van Gelder, who's the vice president of the Seattle Council PTSA, and she had talked with me about a movement that she's helping to organize called the Take Back PTA movement. The Seattle Council PTSA is kind of the coalition of all of the PTSAs in the Seattle School District. So they've actually been working on these equity issues for like a decade. The interesting thing about trying to get a bunch of PTSAs to cooperate is that parents tend to people involved tend to like move out of the system really quickly, right?
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things about like why things move slowly. Most people, like, they move on with their kid to the next PTSA, right? To the next school and their PTSA. So that's just sort of the reality of it. So they've been working on this for like a decade. And in about 2019, they came up with sort of a pledge that individual PTSAs can adopt into their bylaws, that they'll be considering equity and thinking about putting less of a focus on fundraising and more of a focus on advocacy and like parent involvement and that sort of thing. And so that's what that movement is about. I think one of the interesting things that they had said in their pledge is that they are not an ATM. They wanted to send that message to the schools, and to school principals that they are not an ATM. On their website where they describe Take Back PTA, they have a whole statement about like explaining what they are. They call out the districts and the administrators, So they say, quote, "We aren't ATMs, blank checks working at the whims of districts or administrators. We are organizers, problem solvers, centers of school communities, support for families, and we are advocates for all children, for every child." And so when I asked like how many PTAs or PTSAs have adopted this, like, I guess not all of them have adopted it. And so it's like, it's up to each group. Every organization is different, right? And so, and everybody brings in their own sort of priorities and kind of like what they feel they're involved in, right?
What is your sense, based on your reporting, of how big the movement in general, whether we're speaking about Take Back PTA or the West Seattle, South Seattle efforts to achieve better equity in their PTSA fundraising? I mean, how big do you get the sense that this movement is in Seattle public schools?
I think that it's sort of like something that people are aware of. Like the inequities between the schools are something that people are aware of, but I don't get a sense that people have figured out how to solve it. I've also heard of, they said it was kind of too early for them to talk with me, but like I've also heard about similar efforts up in like the North End that, are looking at inequities between the schools there as well. And so I think that it's a popular sentiment, to want equity. I guess my sense of it is that the people who are aware of it are very passionate about it, but kind of the system is the way it is. And so the system kind of remains how it is. And so like, is there like a majority opinion about how to change it or how to make it more equal? I don't know.
And so, yeah, in that regard, I mean, do you get a sense of where Seattle PTSAs might go from here? Is there any sort of next steps that you've heard about from any of these organizations you've spoken with? Or if we had to look into the future and look into the next school year and kind of crystal ball it, what might happen next?
Well, obviously nobody can tell the future. However, something that one of the parents did tell me, that one of the supporters of this movement did tell me, was that ironically, the kind of rising costs for hiring staff is making more people aware of it. So, your $100,000 or your $85,000 doesn't go as far anymore. And so that is also making people aware of like, why is it on the power of parents who can fundraise to fill in whatever it is that people see as a gap at the school, right? And, when I ask folks to kind of look into the future, that was kind of the closest thing I could get to what the future might look like, is that more people are becoming aware of it because just the costs of the system are getting high. And people are starting to think, well, there's got to be a better way.
Thanks for listening to Crosscut Reports. This episode was reported by Venice Buhain and produced by me, Sara Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. You can subscribe to Crosscut Reports wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docu-series we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Seattle's PBS station, KCTS 9. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. That's also where you'll find a text version of the story we discussed today. Crosscut Reports is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Sara Bernard. We'll be back soon with another episode. And just a quick note, we're slowing things down a bit this summer to work on other projects. So start looking for new episodes in your feed every other Wednesday. See you in a couple weeks.